So my talk is about GDPR. So what are we talking about today? GDPR is General Data Protection Regulation. It's pretty dry. I'll just start with that. It's not going to be. It's not so colourful as Jam's talk, which was great. Thanks, Jam. So we'll just get into it straight away and get through a few bits and pieces. So first of all, a little bit about me, just so you can sort of understand who I am and where I come from and why I'm talking about GDPR. And then we've got the whys, whats, whens, and hows, which is a device I've tried to use to do the slides that then really tied my hands later on. So we'll see how we go. Okay, cool. So first a bit about me. My background is all digital PM. Mainly large-scale database analysis tool implementation. So I work for a couple of big companies, large software houses in London and one in Bristol. JHC in London doing financial services, so sort of big stockbroking database and an analysis tool to go with that. And then anyone heard of Blueven in Bristol? Probably not. It's a large marketing services provider. So they're doing sort of big single customer view databases and then analytics and lots of kind of automated marketing and stuff on top of that. So I'm sure you're getting an idea of how I found out about GDPR. And now I'm the head of production at Microserve, so that's what I'm doing here today. So how I found out about GDPR, like I say, sort of makes it sound like there's a funny story, but it's really just I was working at Blueven. They're a large market, they deal with a lot of large companies doing a lot of marketing. And I was running their project to sort of do their implementation around it. They were concerned about the impact of GDPR on all their clients and the very large volume of sort of personal data and things that they held. So I was picking that project up and working with a real specialist on it at the time, which was great, and I was just kind of doing project management type stuff. At the same time, I was talking to Dan at Microsoft about coming on board there, and it just kind of occurred to me that obviously GDPR is more far-reaching than just marketing. It's everything to do with data protection, so it will have an impact for all industries, and obviously the Drupal community covers a range of industries. So I think that I needed to do this piece of work for Microserve, and then when the opportunity came up to sort of present it here as well, I thought this would be a good time to bring it up. The last thing to say on there is just I'm not an expert. I'm a project manager, so I've done a lot of research, obviously, to put the presentation together. But I'm sort of an enthusiastic amateur. So if you think I'm wrong, please say, and we'll have a chat about it. I think it's just good to cover all your bases and make sure we've thought it all through. So, okay. We'll start off with the whys. Why should we care about GDPR? So, why is it being introduced, first of all? Basically, it's being introduced to give people more control over their data. So, a lot of research has been done, and basically people are very, very trusting online, very, very keen to give away data. A lot of people, not everyone obviously, but in general, people are much more trusting. If someone comes to your front door and says, "Oh, would you mind filling in this form? I need your email address and your date of birth and a few other details," you tell them to go away. If you go to a nice website and someone says, "Oh, you can have 5% your first purchase if you tell me your email address and where you live," then you'd get straight into it. So it's just it's a real change in how people give out their information, and it's really to try and address that. So the regulation doesn't want to stop people doing that. Obviously, it's just to really try and give them control back and make sure that if they've given data over, they're then able to control where that data goes, how it's processed, if it's augmented in any way, if it goes anywhere else, and that they could potentially get it back or stop someone from using it or move it somewhere else. So why does it impact me / my clients? Why should you care? So externally, it's relating to personal data, obviously. So sites with users, sites where we're harvesting user data, sites with newsletters, so just picking up email addresses, even if it's just that kind of level of detail. Sites with form submissions, obviously, getting more, if you're taking surveys and things like that, then you're going to be getting a lot of user data in. Preference centers especially, there's a lot of, we'll get into the detail in a bit, but there's a lot of extra stuff around taking people's preferences and consent and things, so we need to focus on those. And then internally as well, so even if we didn't think, as agencies that we were actually impacted by GDPR, we are all companies, and as companies we have employees who are people, and they do have personal data, and we store it. So, client information, obviously we talk to our clients, we store personal information about clients, so that's sort of sales and finance are impacted there. And employee information, like I say, so all your HR and finance details on individuals in your company would be impacted by GDPR as well. Why should I be bothered? So this is the kind of headline that's going around GDPR, and if anyone's heard anything about it, it's probably this, I would imagine. If you are caught in breach of the new regulation, the first offence, the maximum fine is 10 million euros, which might seem a little high. Obviously, it's kind of targeted at larger companies, and that actually, for smaller companies like us, the maximum fine would be 10 million. If you were larger and 2% of your worldwide turnover was higher, the maximum fine would be higher. So a very significant. Second offence, double that up. And then very importantly, our own ICO, our sort of regulatory authority for data protection, will be funded solely by fines going forward. They're receiving no governmental funding, so they are heavily incentivized to catch some people out. So, and in fact, the the new information commission made a little bit, because I was just looking it up this morning. I remember someone telling me an anecdote about it, so I just wanted to check it was true. She, the new information commissioner was appointed at the office in 2016, and she immediately came out and said, I'm coming for you, basically. This was all kind of in the pipeline already, and she's already landed kind of the biggest fines. I think it's talk maybe 400,000. So it's like the biggest fine in the ICO's history, and they're just very interested in obviously pressing ahead in that way. Okay, cool. So that's the whys. I hope that's caught a bit of attention. Some of the whats. So we'll just go through a bit more about what it actually is, what it isn't as well, which is a bit of a funny way to phrase it, and then some of the specifics, like some of the terminology and stuff, just so that everyone gets a bit of an idea of what we're talking about as well. So first of all, what's the history? So I think the thing to take away here is that this isn't something that's kind of coming in overnight. Actually, I forgot to do it at the beginning. I just wanted to do a bit of a straw poll. Had anyone heard of GDPR previously? Other people? Oh, good. Okay, so people knew. Anyone doing anything about it? Cool. 2, 3. Yeah. Great. Okay. It's slightly better than I expected. Actually, that's good. So obviously it's been in the pipeline for years. So even though it's probably really picked up in the last kind of 6 months, people talking about it and getting it moving, getting sort of implementation in place. It's been in process for a long time, so just to go through a little bit of how it came around. There's 3 parts to the European Union, so the Parliament, the Commission and the Council. They all needed to agree what they were going to do and agree all the terminology and things, so that took them 3 years. Finally, in 2015, it all gets sort of signed off. The regulation's actually already been adopted. It's not sort of enforceable yet, but it, strictly speaking, kind of is law, but it has an enactment date. So we're in this 2-year implementation phase, and then next year it will come in. I haven't put the exact date on there. I'll save that for a little treat for the end. Have a look later.
Christmas.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, what isn't it? So there's probably a few bits up there that people might recognise. Data Protection Directive specifically is what it's replacing, so that's the European data standard at the moment. The big thing to take away there is that directive is not law, so the European Union came up with the data directive. It was back in '95, I think. and you weren't obliged to come up with, enforce it in your country. So lots of EU member states don't actually have any data protection regulation. We did implement one, so we implemented the Data Protection Act 1998, which some of you may remember from GCSE IT if you're that kind of person. So there is currently a data protection law in the UK. It's relatively similar. I think there's just, they've tightened up a lot of the specifics and put in a bit more detail. So a few notes there. Just the design of the directive began with the OECD in the 80s, and obviously a lot's changed since the 80s, and just the speed of marketing, the kind of automation and profiling around that, and the amount of information, amount of interaction people have with with the internet, and the opportunities people have to give their information away have increased a huge amount. So really, the regulation is okay, but it doesn't cover that kind of increase in pace that we've seen over the last kind of 30 years. Blimey, 30 years. Okay, what is it? So just a quick reminder, it's General Data Protection Regulation. You see a lot of things online, Global Data Protection Ruling, that's what it's called. So it replaces the European Data Protection Directive. Regulation is law, so it's one of the big things, and we'll get into a bit more detail in a sec, but the regulation is immediately a law. So whilst we're in the EU, which we are, it will come into act and be a law straight away, so it will be enforceable and the fines will take place. There's nothing that the UK government has to do anything extra. It's going to be a single set of rules for everyone, so any EU member states that don't currently have any data protection implementation will get this straight away as well. And like I said before, it aims to give people more control over their personal data, and I think the key word there is people. So, what's the difference? We'll just go through. Like I said, I did quite a bit of research to try and put this together. I read a sort of full comparison between DPD and GDPR, and I'm just really glad that someone else did it first, because it was pretty heavy going. So, like I say, they cover much of the same stuff, and the comparison this person had done really just gave you the kind of differences between each section and where they'd added in extra wording or kind of extra clauses and things. So we'll run through a few different little bits here and see what you mean. This is obviously just some selected highlights as well. It's not the kind of the full differences that goes beyond this, but this is probably what affects us the most, I would think, hopefully. So scope of the kind of regulation, scope of the law. So with DPD, it was to do with the nationality of the company. So if you were a company and you were controlling data for anyone, anywhere, but you were in the EU registered company, then DPD had an impact on you. GDPR, they've kind of flipped that on its head, and they're saying they're interested in protecting EU data subjects, so EU people. Ignore some of the terminology, we'll get into that. The protecting EU citizens. So if you're a company anywhere in the world and you're processing the data of EU citizens, the EU will try and sort of enforce GDPR on you. Obviously, if you're in the EU, they've got a really good mechanism for doing that. If you're outside of the EU, they've added a lot of extra legislation for how they'll do that. There's some kind of international law for following this kind of stuff up. I've got some details on it later. But so even if you are outside of the EU but you're processing data, they will try and pick you up on it. Liability. So it's a big one, and when we're looking at those big fines at the beginning, this is obviously a really important one. So we'll get into data controllers and data processors in a moment, but previously it was only data controllers who were liable under DPD, and now it's data controllers and data processors. Probably most companies here will be one or both of those. You're certainly a data controller. You might also be a data processor, and that might be where you deal with sort of bigger volumes of data. So that's just a big thing that's changed in there. Consent. So consent is to do with consent is to do with kind of preferences and that sort of thing. So if you're taking consent to contact someone or to send them something or to store their data or move their data or anything like that, the only change that they've made here is to add the word unambiguous. So I've got a few examples of this later on, but basically it's just that they've really sort of tightened that up. Obviously they want to make sure it's a much clearer consent and specific and kind of appropriate to what you're doing as well. And then the not last one, sorry. Next one is right to erasure, which is commonly called right to be forgotten. So under DPD, it was basically that if you thought someone had your data, you could ring them up and check out what it was, and if it was inaccurate, you could tell them to erase you from their database. So if it was inaccurate or incomplete under DPD, under GDPR, I've put there on data subject objection. So basically, if someone objects, there is actually a really long list of circumstances, but they're all quite sort of waffly, and it's such a long list that I think basically the net result is if someone rings you up and says delete my data, you haven't really got a leg to stand on. You've got to do it. And then rights. So this is probably one of the bigger changes as well. Obviously, we've got that right to erasure in DBD, but there's very little mention of other explicit rights. In GDPR, lots and lots of things have been converted to rights of the individual. So rather than just being, we recommend you do this, or people might like it if you treat them nicely, they've kind of explicitly made them rights. It makes it much more kind of enforceable and much clearer in court. That's a piece of legal terminology. So it's much clearer how those things should be treated. So rights around lodging complaints, judicial remedy, which is punishment, fines, and compensation. Obviously, just compensation to the individual as well.
Could you just quickly give a few examples of what activities are and aren't data controllers, and what activities are and aren't data processors?
That is a slide in like 2 slides, so we'll get there. Don't worry. I mean, there's lots. Yeah, I will do. Yeah, absolutely. So just broadly though, what does that mean? So there are many fewer grey areas in GDPR. I would say responsibility is more clearly defined. Yeah, sure. Increased right for individuals, fine. I think that really the main thing is that they're trying to take data protection from like kind of an inconvenience for most companies to a real obligation, and making it be data protection by design in all the things we do, so our processes and our products as well, so our software. It's far more enforceable, like we said, with those rights and things like that, and basically, like the ICO commissioner was saying, they mean business. They want to get out there and get some fines, so I think that's pretty clear from the way the regulations changed. So let's take a look at some of the specifics, which I think you will be pleased to see. What are data controllers and what processes? Fair enough, that's not too specific. I'll try and go through a few. But controller, so it's kind of how it sounds. You're a controller if you're the company that owns the data and makes decisions about what happens to it. And like we said previously, that used to be enough. So if you were a controller and you went to a third party and said, please, process my data, but they did something a bit funny, but they didn't kind of tell you about it, then it's sort of not your fault and not their fault and not really anyone's fault, and everyone's looking at each other. But GDPR now, processors will be just as liable. So if you give data to someone to process and they do something that we don't like, then everyone gets in trouble basically. So contracted by the controller to move, augment, update, or even just hold the data. So processing is really, I think, probably a company that holds their own data and keeps it in a database and does some actions on it as well is both, if you see what I mean. And that if you happen to use a third party for it, then there is a controller and a processor, but that one company could be both things. So really anything from even like our hosting providers like Acquia and others, would be considered processors if they're holding a website that has a lot of data in it. So it's a big area. Is that specific enough? Would you want to?
Somebody who just provides hosting, even if they have no idea how that's used, is a processor.
Yeah, I think so. Really, that's certainly my interpretation. So I would not like to risk it if I was a hosting provider.
If you've provided the system and you're hosting it, you're definitely a data processor. If you are just providing hardware, then it's more questionable.
Yeah, I guess it's more questionable, but I think it's ambiguous perhaps, and that they would, if something went wrong and there was a breach on your third-party hosting side, then they would say who's the provider here, if you see what I mean. You're probably one controller with two processors, not a controller with a processor and a third party, would be my interpretation of that. But I guess we'd get into the specifics when something goes wrong. Okay, so term that's come up quite a bit, what is a data subject? So this is actually what they call people in the regulation. It's a little bit backwards here. I've just kind of pulled it out from the actual regulation because it was a bit tricky to explain. Personal data means any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, data subject. So basically they're people who can be identified or have been identified by the information that you hold on them. That's it basically. So then what counts as personal data, which is the next bit of it, and they kind of lean sort of back to back on each other. So personal data, someone who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, identification number, location data. So I guess we're including addresses, but also longs and lats and things like that if we've got that kind of stuff. An online identifier, which is a brand new group of identifiers for GDPR as well, so this is a big difference, which will include IP address and things like device IDs and that kind of stuff as well. So I don't know, I'm not particularly technical, but if that kind of stuff gets stored in cookies or whatever against users and things like that, then that's all kind of comes under this area. And then a little bit on the bottom about some other weird stuff that they want to try and regulate, but I don't think that affects us too much. Hopefully sort of anyone doing any genetic data stuff, that'd be pretty cool. So basically the data subject is anyone that you hold any of that information on. So I think we can see that's pretty much anyone in any user in a Drupal website is going to have some of that information. And then if anyone's doing any data augmentation or anything with third-party services like address cleansing or anything like that, then that would kind of fall into this as well. Okay. What's a subject access request? So this is something that hasn't come up so much. It's kind of related to that right to be forgotten that we spoke about. So to do a right to be forgotten, I suppose they've got to do a subject access request first. So this is someone contacting you and saying, I want to see my data. I want to know what data you hold on me in all of your systems. I think it's just really important that we think about how we would deliver that, because I spoke to a couple of developers about it and they said, it's easy, don't worry, it's all it's all on the user, it's fine. But is it? Is there something off in a little database that's kind of just getting referenced to and things like that? Are we pulling in stuff from third parties on the same people and we've got lots of information on the user, but if you're integrated with another system for single sign-on or something like that, you're still moving that data around. What's happening there? So we need to be able to provide all this information to someone if they came back to us with a subject access request. And sorry, importantly, it's a right of the individual, so they can do this. We have to do it. They don't have to pay. So I think after like the first one or two, they have to start paying for them because it's sort of seen as being malicious or something. But anyone can ring you up once and do this, and you'd have to spend time getting the information for them, and you're not allowed to charge them. So if they do come to you, you have to confirm what data you hold on them, how it's being processed, so any kind of processes that, like I said, augment, move, or I guess just augment or move is probably the main thing. Where you got it from, and if you got it from multiple places and put it together, how you did that. Where it's going, and if it's going to multiple places, then where it's going to all of them. How long it's being retained, or at least some idea of how you might work out how long it's being retained. And any profiling, which I think is quite a big big part of what we're doing increasingly. And it's not profiling in the sense of sort of very negative sense to that word in some cases, but just profiling in the sense of like, you bought something blue off me, maybe I'll send you some adverts for blue stuff. That's profiling. I know these people like blue things, they keep on buying blue things. So that kind of information you need to be able to explain to them as well. So I think the question here really is just, currently, how would your company respond if someone rang you up and said, we need to do this? I guess in our case, actually, a subject access request is maybe more likely to come from a client and them say, I've got 10 subject access requests from one of my websites. I need to find all the information. Please, can you let me know what it all is? You need to present it back to them in a certain fashion.
But isn't that really complicated? If the request can go to the processor or the owner of the data, and somebody could come to you as microserve and say, have you got any data on me? And you'd have 200 clients to check.
Yeah, I think that can be the case. Yeah, so like I say, it's not not good. Just need to be prepared. I think like you say, it's much more likely that someone would go to a controller. It's obvious, and that this is one area that the guys at Blueven, this big marketing company I was working with, were really concerned about. And like I say, they've got huge databases, millions of customers for lots and lots of big clients, and they were very concerned that this was going to turn into sort of the new kind of like PPI type situation, and that someone's going to set up a company and ring up 100,000 people and say, I'll give you £5 if you tell me everyone you've ever sent any data to. I'll do your subject access request, and then you can have half of any compensation I get, or whatever. And they're expecting a lot of activity in the middle of next year. They're very big clients with huge customer bases. So I think we maybe don't need to worry about quite that scale. But I don't know who your clients are. So if you've got some really big sort of user-based clients, then it's perhaps something to worry about. And then what can the data subject? What can a data subject request off the back of the data subject request? Amends, erasure, and transfer. So you either need to be able to update the data for them, remove it from the database and show that you have, or transfer it to somewhere else and they can kind of request where they want it to go, pretty much. So you need to be able to move it for them as well. And not everyone works in Drupal, obviously, so more problems. What about preferences? A slightly contrived question, but yeah, so going back to the consent stuff that we're talking about in the differences. So what we had in the difference table was the word unambiguous. So DPD, we just needed to get consent. Now we need to get unambiguous consent. So I have interpreted this, and it has been broadly interpreted as no more assumed consent. And I think you can see we've got one of those pretty standard terms and conditions box. I actually thought when I was writing this slide that I hadn't seen one of these for ages, and then I happened to see one on the morning when I was signing up for something. So this is one I actually got on the day, which is a bit of a coincidence. So all unticked, and I do not wish to receive. So I hope I've got this right now. If you tick that, you're saying you don't want to, so it's assuming that you do want to, and that's just not going to be okay anymore after May. So if you've got these on websites for people, you need to start talking to your clients and saying, that slightly dodgily worded consent thing we've got that we were hoping would drum up a bit of business, we need to be a bit cleverer with it, or change the wording, or add some extra levels to it, or something like that.
So it's explicitly opt out, explicitly opt in.
Explicitly opt in, absolutely. And so the other part of it is the appropriate. So it needs to be, so for example, this is Great Run. It's quite a good one, actually. So I do not wish to receive information from Great Run. Fair enough. I mean, like, if it was, I do wish to receive information from Great Run, I think that's kind of fine. You know, then they can just send you some information. That's pretty well worded. I do not wish to receive information from Great Run event partners. Likewise, pretty good. If you got one that was, you know, do not contact me about my purchase, for example. You know, sometimes I don't know, you know, sometimes you get sort of funny worded ones at the end of shops and things, don't you? Then if someone hadn't ticked that and so you could contact them about their purchase, don't contact them about anything else, if you see what I mean. So if you've been that specific, make sure, yeah, sorry, do you want to?
Do you think on something like that you would actually have to explicitly link from a form like that on the partner bit to show what your policy was for sharing data with third parties as well? You could look at that and just say, well, actually, I don't know whether I would want you to do that or not because I don't know who you might share it with. Yeah.
I mean, any additional information is all just going to be viewed as to the good, basically. So I think that, like I say, the way that GDPR is pointing is if you're helping the data subject out, you know, if you're not trying to mug them over for their data, basically, then, you know, if you have a breach, then it will be more leniently kind of looked upon. You know, if you're seen to be doing everything that you can and that your processes are all pretty good, and you're doing stuff like that, then I think it would all be sort of positive.
Different if the data subject is a business or signing up.
So data subjects are only people. Businesses, you can have as much business data as you want. It's individuals' personal data. Cool. So yeah, just something to think about for clients running shops or newsletters or that kind of thing. Okay. What constitutes a breach? So pretty obvious as well, I guess, really, but it's good to be clear. Data being physically or digitally insecure, so someone getting into your system and getting a load of stuff, or, you know, if you break your password policy or whatever, and, you know, everyone's got the same admin password on a website, I know obviously nobody does that, so that's fine. Yeah, so, you know, if you break your own policies and things are insecure in that way, it's kind of just as bad as people, you know, the data actually getting out, I think, really. And the regulation being broken, obviously, so there's lots of timings around how quickly you have to get back to people on subject access requests and stuff like that. I'm sorry, I haven't got the detail here. But, you know, you need to respond to those things quickly, and you definitely need to respond, otherwise that's just a breach. In the event of a breach, we must report to the supervisory authority no later than 72 hours. So for us, that's the ICO. Just need to let them know. Probably have a plan for that in advance, so that, you know, like on day one, when you accidentally send everyone's email address and the whole company to somebody else, you've got a good channel to do that quickly. And communicate to the data subject as well. So if it's, you know, high risk for them, it might impinge on their rights and freedoms, then we need to make sure that they know what's going on.
Does that mean if you sent any data over HTTP rather than HTTPS, that could identify a person?
I think if you, yeah, sure. I don't know. I think in those cases, perhaps you'd have to show that it had been like picked up as well. If you know what I mean, like you could, like if you just sent it, unless it's, you know, directly in contravention of your policies, and then you have a problem as a result of it, then that would cause a problem for you, obviously. They're obviously not going to be able to like pick you up on that unless something goes wrong, I suppose, and it draws attention to it. So
if I see a company who's not using HTTPS, I could say, well, you should be using it. Or any of our clients who aren't using it should be using it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could do. I think, again,
that's the sort of advice we would be giving.
I think it would be good to be advising people on it, basically. Yeah, you know, if you're talking to your clients and they've got a slightly funky, or I don't know, I mean, like there's FTP and SFTP and stuff as well, isn't there? So, you know, likewise, just make sure everything is really, really tight, and try and be as sort of ironclad on it as possible. Okay, so I think last of the whats. What about Brexit? So we're leaving the EU. It doesn't matter. Hooray! So GDPR will come into force before we leave, obviously. That's the main thing. So, you know, we will have it even for a period. The Great Repeal Bill, it's not often you get to write that down, is it? It's good. We'll probably make it law in the UK. I say probably because we don't really know what's going on, do we? But you know, I don't think we should assume that it won't be law in the UK. It won't be that it's the EU GDPR, but we will have our own law that matches all the protocols and things. So that would be the expectation. We shouldn't assume it won't apply. And even if we were out, it does count for third countries, so you still got to do it. Cool, some whens. Put it in your calendar. May 25th, 2018. So when I started talking about this, it was like still sort of 15 months away. It's kind of creeping up now. So just, definitely put it in your calendar and start having a think about it, basically. That's the implementation date. When's was short. How's? How can I make sure I'm GDPR compliant? You can't. Too bad. It's really sneaky of them, actually. The regulation mentions compliance a lot, and it has lots of recommendations for member states that they set up, lots of support for people to become compliant, and so on and so on, but they don't provide any sort of qualification for what compliance means. And I was sort of thinking about it and thinking, what a dick move, but like, it kind of, you can't do that. If you're the legislating authority, you can't do that, because if you give a compliance checklist and someone complies and they tick 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 tick, fine, and then breach and 200 million people's details get stolen, who's to blame? Who's at fault? It's be the authority, because they've not set the standard high enough, and that's not the purpose of the exercise. So the aim really with this kind of thing is to get across its spirit of the law and not letter of the law, and that's a common sort of feature in this kind of legislation now, that you should not be looking at the legislation and going, well, I can do this, I can get around this bit here, and I'll make loads of money by being sneaky on data protection. But that's not the idea. The idea is to help people out and help them, have control over their data and not take advantage. Cases will all be judged on an individual basis. So if you are found in breach, it's not, like there's bam, 10 million euro fine, thank you very much. It is, judged on how many people are affected, what sort of information it was, what the risk is to them, the kind of general impact and stuff. So fines will be, can be large, but should be appropriate to the breach. And you'll just need to be able to show that you're doing everything that you can, basically. I think, as we've spoken about, just do anything you can. Get it on the board, make as much conversation about it as you can, to show that you're doing everything possible. Yeah, so how can I start to prepare? So ICO, it's not really very helpful, is it? ICO for information. So they are both going to fine you horribly, but they're also obliged to help you out with not getting fined horribly. So there is quite a lot of information on their website. They do a checklist that is not a compliance checklist, but it is a data security checklist. It's a bit like kind of very cheap ISO standard, I suppose, that you can go through and say, yeah, I'm doing this, brilliant. So I advise everyone have a look at that. ISO obviously is the big one. I don't know, if you are ISO 27001 compliant already and you have a process and you pass your audit every year, then you're probably pretty good. You want to make sure you keep that process going and keep improving, obviously. But that's probably the closest you could get to being genuinely compliant at the moment. But that doesn't mean breaches don't happen, and you need to still stay on top of it. Add GDPR to your boards, mention that, or if you've got an information security manual, that kind of thing, just make sure it is being regularly discussed by senior management at your organisation. Discuss it with your clients, yeah, so like we're saying, if someone's doing something a bit funky, make sure you're checking in with them and saying, we really strongly advise you do this. Obviously we don't need to stop working with everyone who's being a bit insecure, probably. But really drumming it home with them and making sure they've got an action plan in place to step up a bit, improve their game. discuss it with your suppliers as well, so it's just as important as your clients. You know, if you're getting data from people or hosting, for example, you need to make sure, I think probably most major hosting providers that we talk to are 27001 compliant, so that's a really good first step. But you want to make sure that you know that they are, and that you've seen their manual, and that you know how it works. And plan to handle data subject access requests. So I think that's probably the biggest one. Like I said, you know, if the numbers of those are as I'm afraid of, then it could be quite big.
Is there any rule for subject access request? Like, do I need to have a telephone number? Can it be done by a ticket, as Facebook or Google does it currently?
People, I think they can make them in pretty much any format. I don't think there's any ruling around how they can give them in. They could come and knock on your door.
Time.
Sorry?
And the response time?
Oh, response time. I think it's 72 hours as well. Like the breach thing. I'm sorry, I haven't got a note on that. But I'll take a look and find out. There definitely is a limit though on the response time. You have to respond and within a time limit. Any questions? I've had a few through the thing, so I'll just put a bit of a summary up. People can have a look. That's pretty much it though, really. Just, yep, sorry.
If one of your clients is acting as a processor and a controller, like one of our clients, and they're in breach of this, how does that affect the agency as a processor of their data?
Sure. So I think it would only, if they're both a processor and a controller, and it's related to the data that they are both controlling and processing, and not the data that you're processing, not your problem. If it's the same data, then yeah, you're involved, I guess. And the definition of the same data, I think, would be related to, if it's getting passed back and forth between the two of you, that kind of thing. Or they pass it to you, you do something to it, you pass it back to them.
So we, as an agency or as a controller, you'd be it's like negligence on our part if we're processing that data, but we're not aware of the breach that's happening behind their doors. We're negligent. It's negligence on our behalf, and so we're liable for a penalty.
I think.
Or is it then judged on a case-by-case basis? And if you can prove that your own, as a company's, our own data protection policies are tight.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I say, you're absolutely right. So in the specifics, it gets judged on a case-by-case. So without wanting you to go into too many details about this company that's doing a breach, you want to find out about that if you're worried about it, and make sure that you are doing everything that your company can to not cause the breach.
It's going to become a pretty big issue for a lot of agencies that manage a lot of client websites, because the majority of our clients have no clue what GDPR even stands for.
Right.
And these are clients that have customer data they've got hundreds and hundreds of accounts. Some of them have thousands of accounts storing addresses and names and preferences and whatever.
No, absolutely. So that's, like I say, I think it's a big risk, and it's definitely something you need to talk about with all your clients as much as possible. Cool. Do you want to go to this lady, because you had one earlier, if that's all right?
No, I was just wondering, does this only apply to companies? What if the data controller processor is a small voluntary organisation or community group comprised of individuals?
I think anything that's kind of incorporated in that way counts. If you're just individuals, if you are just a person, then fine, you can store as much personal data as you like, as long as it's deemed to be for personal purposes. But I think there would be...
Even if it's online?
Even if it's online, yeah.
So you're running a community website?
I think as long as you're just an individual, yeah, if you're running a community website, once there's some idea of a... exactly, yeah, then...
So voluntary organisations that aren't incorporated are not subject to this law?
I wouldn't want to give you...
Almost certainly be.
I wouldn't want to give specifics.
Right.
Yeah. But definitely, I think always err on the side of caution is probably going to be my answer to all of these questions. So, hello.
Would there be a requirement then on clients to be ISO 27001 compliant, do you think?
Not a requirement, but it would certainly be something you'd advise people of a certain size start looking at. Companies of a certain size. Smaller companies, you might be able to control it well anyway, and you know, basically put in a good process yourselves. All ISO is a process. So you know, just if you come up with your own manual, brilliant. As long as you stick to it. But once you're of a certain size, I guess getting someone in who knows what they're doing and writing you a manual is probably a good idea. Others? Yeah.
That was a really good talk, Rob.
Oh, thank you.
So after I found out that you're doing the talk on GDPR,
Yeah.
I started a new role as a freelancer on Monday. And I thought I'd ask when there was a big team meeting if anyone knew about GDPR.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just one person that did. So one of the things I'm planning to do is go back and impart some of this wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
But one sub-question there is, what can other freelancers start doing today to start preparing? Because I suppose we can play a role in assisting, and one of the answers I received back was legal are looking into it.
Right.
But so that's the tech team kind of ticking the box of, okay, somebody's dealing with it. But what can people be doing today?
No, I think that's fair enough. And obviously, freelancers are, you know, a big community of freelancers in the Drupal community. So it's not something I've really touched on at all, and that's probably a bit of a shortfalling. I think that obviously you are in some respects going to be a processor as a freelancer. You know, if you're working for someone else, I think that if you're directly, you know, working for a controller, so someone hires you to do something for them directly, then you're responsible for what you do. If you are working for a company, I think that you are probably able to kind of point at their processes and things and say, I'm following their process, I've advised them it's not good enough. But should we do it together? Err on the side of caution. Yeah, I don't know the specifics there, sorry, but I would guess that if you're working for a bigger company who is a processor for another client, you could kind of point the finger at them a bit. Anyone else? Or do you want to call it there? Cool. We've run out of time. Sorry. Good.